Well, welcome to chapter 33. 3 more to go. Well, today we're going to learn the imperative. Just 3 basic things apart from form about the imperative. First of all, the imperative is the mood of command. In other words, if you want to tell someone to do something, the verb goes into the imperative, right? Second of all, in English, all imperatives are second person, right? If I say, answer me, the implied subject is you, either you singular or you plural. In Greek, we have second and third person imperatives. And what you're going to see is that we'll use a phrase, something like let. So if you had a third person imperative, you'd say, let him answer. Second person will be answer. Third person is let him or let them answer. And finally, we're only going to learn the forms for 2 imperatives, the present imperative and the aorist imperative. There are only 4 perfect imperatives in the New Testament. They're listed in the textbook. We won't learn them. But we're going to learn imperatives that are formed on the present tense stem. And what do you think they're going to indicate? Continuous action, right. And what do you think the imperative built on the unaugmented aorist tense stem is going to indicate? Undefined action. See, so simple, isn't it? So easy. No time at all, only aspect. Okay, well, here's the imperatival morpheme chart. I have tried, I don't know how many different ways, to find a way to summarize what the imperative looks like in the second person singular. I just haven't been able to do it. I can't find an easy way to do it. And when I first learned the imperatives, I started with the second person singular, and because they were different from tense to tense, I mistakenly thought that the imperative was irregular. But as you can see, the rest of the imperative is blissfully regular. So here's what I do with the imperatival morpheme chart. The second person singular has a question mark. That just means it differs from tense to tense. And I memorize it as something, to, te, tosin. And then in the middle passive, the tau is replaced with a sigma theta, and I get something, stho, sthe, sthosin. Okay, so when you see it that way, it's absolutely regular and easy to learn. It's just the second person singular forms are going to have to be memorized. Notice also that the left-hand column is what the imperative looks like in the active and the aorist passive. Now, we've seen that over and over again, haven't we? That the aorist passive uses active forms. Okay, what about these second-person singular imperatives? Let's look at some of them here. If you saw pistiue, and if I told you this is an imperative, you know it's got to be a second-person singular. Second-person singular present active imperative is an epsilon. So pistiue would be translated believe. Or if you wanted to say you believe, you could, if it fit the context. Now, how are you going to indicate the difference between a present imperative and an aorist imperative? You can't. I mean, it's really hard. You could say something like, continue to believe versus the simple believe. But again, that's horrid English. And so most people just say, translate the present and the aorist imperatives the same way. That's why they're preachers. Because it's really interesting to watch in the New Testament when the imperatives are present and when they're aorist, when they're continuous and when they're undefined. Very hard to bring out the difference in a translation, though. Okay, if you saw pistueto, how would you translate that? Something, to, te, tosin. Yeah, you're going to have a subject of some sort from the context, aren't you? Let's say it's a her, but Mary is the subject of the imperative, and you would translate it, let her believe. Okay? Do you see that? The translation on these is pretty straightforward. Here's a harder one. Erhu, it's second person singular imperative. How are you going to translate that? Go. Or come, whatever side of the erchomai you want. The point of the illustration is that if a verb is deponent in the present in the indicative, it's also deponent in the imperative. Have you seen that by now? That a verb being deponent has nothing to do with its mood, it only has to do with its tense. So if a verb is deponent in the present indicative, it'll be deponent in all of its present forms, regardless of mood. So erhu is come. Labete. You can see one of the interesting problems. The endings are something, to, te, tosen. So this is it looks like a second person plural indicative from labo, right? But guess what? No such thing. So you look at that and you may think it's an indicative second plural. You look at the stem and you say, is that the present tense stem? Is that the stem I memorized? The answer is no. It's an unaugmented aorist. Ah, all right. It's a second person plural aorist active imperative, and you translate it. You got to think English. Okay, this is not a Greek thing. This is an English thing at this point. How do you tell a group of people to lambano something? Receive. I wanted you to see the process I went through, all right? You may think this is a second person plural indicative, but when you look at the stem, you go, ooh, that's not a present tense stem. Ow, it's an unaugmented aorist. I don't have ete in a second person plural aorist. There's got to be something else. Oh, that's right. Something to, te, tosen, second person plural aorist active imperative from lambano. So if you saw bleithetosen, something to, te, tosen, okay, you know it's a third plural. You look at the bleithe, and you know you are in an aorist passive form. So you know that this is an aorist passive imperative, third person plural. Okay, how do I say that? See, third person will be let them. Okay, the verb is balo, throw, but I have to make it passive. Let them be thrown out of class. No, just teasing. Just teasing. Okay, you see that? Again, what you're doing, same thing we've been doing with other verbal forms, is that you've got to say, okay, what is this grammatically? And then you say, ooh, how do I say that in English? Let them be thrown. Let me just run through the paradigms very quickly. You'll need to spend time with them in your textbook. You're just going to have to memorize the second person singular imperatival forms. And on the master imperative chart, you're going to see that the second person singular forms are listed along with the third singular. And I don't know of any cute way to help you remember those things. You're just going to have to memorize them. So if you're in the active, the columns are, the left column is the present imperative, and the middle column is the aorist imperative, and the far right's a translation. So in the present active, you have lue, lueto, luete, luetosen. You can see the second person singular is the only problem. If you go into the aorist active, if it's a first aorist, it's going to be luson, or whatever stem you have. And if it's a second aorist, remember, second aorist use the same forms that the presents do. So these patterns exist all the way through the different moods. It's labe. So once again, you look at labe. You see the epsilon and you go, oh, second person singular imperative from labo. Oh, there's no such word. Must be an aorist. See why you have to know your stems? Have to know your stems. Lusato, lusate, lusatosen, second aorist, labeto, labete, labetosen. So there's your active imperatives. It's only the second person singular that's an issue. When you get into the middles, same thing. Present middle is luu, luesto, lueste, luestosen. If it's a first aorist, it's lusai. What does that look like? Looks like infinitive, doesn't it? Same form, same letters between this and the infinitive. They're very, very hard to confuse in context, though. Because an infinitive normally is like following a verb, or it's going to have an article with a preposition or something with it. That'll be the clue that it's an infinitive. They're very difficult to confuse in context. But you have lusai, lusasto, lusaste, lusastosin. If it's a second aorist, genu, genesto, geneste, genestosin. And if you have a passive, well, in the present, middle and passive are the same form, so there's no difference there. Lu'u, luesto, luesta, luestosin. But in the aorist passive, all aorist passives are formed off of a different tense stem from the aorist actives, right? So you have that change. And if it's a first aorist, it's lutheti. There's your second singular ending. Lutheto, lutheta, luthetosin. If it's a second aorist, grapheti, grapheto, graphete, graphetosin. I wanted to run through the paradigms because they're a little different. But I want you to see what you have to know is question mark, totetosin. And then question mark, sthosthestosin. But you're going to have to memorize the second person singular forms. Translations on these things are a piece of cake. Just make it a command. If it's third person, use let. Now let me give you one other very interesting piece of news. There's no more moods. We're actually done, in a real sense. The last two chapters have to do with something called me verbs, and there's a slightly different way of the way the verbs form themselves. But in terms of tenses and moods, we're done. This is it basically in the Greek language.